if you look at the election in Tasmania, it was conducted according to the Faulty Towers episode, Nobody Mentioned the Germans. So what the Labor Party and the Liberal Party knew was that 60% of Tasmanians don't want the stadium. They're both terrified that maybe over 60% of people would agree to the stadium if it was necessary to have the team. And so it was really important for them not to deliberate on that question. The strategy is to avoid difficulty, because if you avoid difficulty and you give these bland, abstract answers, my plan, all this stuff, we've got a positive plan for the future, not like my opponents, they'll make you pay. The best you can do is to not have those things discussed, because there's nothing in it for you. You end up in a difficult radio interview, which then gets written up as gaff.
Hi there, I'm Bernard Keane from Crikey, and I'm talking with economist and national treasure. He doesn't like me when I say that. Nicholas Gruen.
I do. If you could get more people to do it, I mean, what's there not to like?
Well, we'll make it a meme. We'll memeify.
Memeify it. That's right.
National treasure, Nicholas Gruen. We're talking about the quality of decision making in our political system, or in other terms, how the public interest, the national interest, got crowded out of our decision making systems, and how we can maybe. We don't want to be counsels of despair, push it back into such systems. The reason I like talking to Nicholas is I think he's thinking in this whole area of quality decision makings in democracies is just way ahead of everyone else. And he's able to bring not just an economist's perspective, but dare I say it, a philosopher's perspective even, when an ex-historian like me is still sort of scratching around in the dust, looking at individual sort of dot points of data. The area that I want to start in as our kind of our example that both Nicholas and I think is highly relevant to this discussion is one that Nicholas has had some first-hand involvement in, which is the imbroglio over the new AFL Stadium in Hobart. The reason we want to start there is not particularly because of the big political impact that it's had in Tasmania. The Tasmanians are still counting the votes from their recent election. But as a good working example of how the public interest has been crowded out of our decision-making process. We both think that's a good place for us to start there, and then hopefully broaden that out into a somewhat deeper analysis. Nicholas, to start off, one, could you give a very brief summary of your role in this, so we've got the full disclosure out of the way, but then reflect on the deliberation, or perhaps lack thereof, and the decision making of the previous Tasmanian government in relation to the stadium proposal, and what we can conclude from what happened there.
Yeah, so I think it's worth sort of setting the scene about how my inquiry came about, because it's so unusual. So people may recall that at the last Tasmanian election, the governing Liberal Party lost quite a few seats and ended up in minority government, or at least negotiating with the crossbench. And then the Labor Party essentially, I'd never seen this before, but the Labor Party essentially said they weren't really interested in governing, and so the crossbench didn't have a lot to negotiate with. But the three members of the Jackie Lambie network held the balance, held enough votes to give Jeremy Rockcliffe a majority in the Legislative Assembly, and they did so on condition that certain inquiries were held. And Saul Eslake was one of those inquiries into the state of the government accounts, the state of Tasmanian fiscal, the budget and debt. Another was an inquiry by me into the stadium that is currently planned for Hobart. Another one was an inquiry into the progress or lack thereof of anti-corruption measures in Tasmania. Now, and so I conducted an independent inquiry into essentially the economics of this stadium. Now, why I give you that long story is that it shows you how unusual this is. Governments appoint so-called independent inquiries all the time, but they give those inquiries to sound chaps, and there is I don't want to say that all the people doing so-called independent inquiries will give governments the answers they want, but they're part of a wider system of patronage, and they know that if they produce answers that aren't seen as generally helpful, then maybe they won't get another gig. Mm-hmm. Now, that was quite different in this case. So that's an interesting thing to think about. So I did this review. The review sort of pointed out what people more or less knew, that the government had stretched the truth about how much it would need to borrow to finish this thing, and that it was not very economic, generating about less than 50 cents in the dollar. And this gave a kind of public imprimatur to the people who were opposing the stadium. And this then led to me being attacked by the government as inherently anti-stadium. I don't think I want to go into all that stuff. It wasn't, I think you and I both agree, Bernard, it wasn't in terribly good faith. And that's the situation that we went to the Tasmania, that was the situation when the new election was held. Mm. And the new election has produced the same situation as the last election. There's been a small swing to the Liberal government. It doesn't seem enough to have them picking up any seats. And I guess what I feel is that the way in which the stadium process has gone fails a basic democratic test. And this is the test. Will a large number of people who disagree with the ultimate decision accept that as a democratic decision? Mm-hmm. And I think the answer is no, because it has been entirely clear, firstly, that the way the decision was made was way too hasty. It acquired the appearance of an ultimatum from the AFL. Build a stadium or you don't get the team. Build the stadium here on prime waterfront land, which has there are all kinds of ways you can argue it's not the right site, or you don't get the team, and so on. So the government, now if you put yourself in the position of the government or the opposition, in our system, the government's thinking, can I get some political advantage out of this? And the opposition are thinking, how do I get an advantage? Do I oppose the stadium? 60% of people in Tasmania oppose the stadium. The interesting question is what that number becomes when you ask them a different question, which is, if you can't renegotiate a more reasonable agreement with the AFL, do you want to essentially accept this bullying by the AFL and hand over $1 billion to build a stadium? We don't know the answer to that. The political system isn't trying to find an answer to that, and that's not so surprising. That's not so unlike the kinds of problems with democratic decision-making that we are finding all over the world and certainly in Australia.
Now, the Tasmanian government, the then and the once and future government, perhaps, it garbed its deliberations in the clothing of proper assessment. So KPMG got brought in to do quite a bit of work. There was a bespoke body was established to be the agency in charge of this. Up until a few weeks before the election, the planning process for this stadium was proceeding in at least some good faith on the part of the planning agency that was assessing it, which turned out to end up agreeing quite a bit with your take on it. Was there any element of good faith in that, or was that, as perhaps I've already flagged, I think what the answer to the question is, was this just clothing for a decision that had already been taken for small p political reasons? And we had the accoutrements of deliberation, but not the substance of it.
So there's a good contrast here. So the Macquarie Point Development Corporation, which is a product of the Tasmanian bureaucracy, and therefore there is a fair bit of capacity for ministerial control. And if there isn't ministerial control, there is still a sense of, let me just say, bureaucratic careerism. And it's been quite clear that the Macquarie Point Development Corporation is trying to get this stadium done. And if you present it with problems, you get the sorts of answers back from it that you would get from an apologist, from someone who wants to build the stadium. I mean, the Macquarie Point Development Corporation, you can argue, should want to build the stadium, but it's not it's not appropriate for it to be an advocacy body, and it has clearly. It's quite clear that KPMG knew the answer that the Macquarie Point Development Corporation wanted. And let me just give you a small example of that. Lots of people in Tasmania say there will be larger crowds when the Tassie Devils are involved. We agree. I agree with that. But there's a big difference in the makeup of the crowds so at the moment there are games played in Tasmania. Hawthorn and North Melbourne each play 4 games as a sort of away home games. They play games, North Melbourne in Bellerive Stadium in Hobart, and Hawthorn at York Park in Launceston. Now, they certainly the Hawthorn has taken the whole exercise more seriously. They have 6 people working full time in Tasmania in their operations, and it's not unusual for them to get a crowd of 15,000 or more. Now, here's the thing. A game at York Park has 2 mainland teams in it, and so we said that when you have a game with the Tassie Devils and a mainland team, you will get more total spectators, but you'll get a lot fewer, probably around half as many interstate visitors. And that matters for the economics of it. If you can get someone to travel from the mainland down to where you are and stay in a hotel and go on a day trip around the countryside, that's worth a lot more to the Tasmanian economy than somebody who spends the afternoon at York Park. So we corrected this figure in KPMG's analysis. There's never been any response from KPMG because KPMG is pursuing the same media management strategy as the government was and as the Macquarie Point Development Corporation was, which is to not mention my report because it would be better if it didn't exist. I don't begrudge the politicians doing that. Sadly, the state of our politics is such that I look at that as essentially their job. It's not KPMG's job. I don't believe it should be the MPDC, the Macquarie Point Development Corporation's job. But they're all getting caught up in this because of the incentives that are operating in that environment. Now, the Tasmanian Planning Commission is an independent body, an independent statutory body, and that could still be a compliant organisation if the government had made sure that it had put cronies onto the Tasmanian Planning Commission. They absolutely have not done that. And the Tasmanian Planning Commission, I think, not just because it agrees with me, but because it's been very forceful in asserting its own independence. And the result of that is they've said this whole plan has major problems with it. And that was in a draft report. And so the government knows that it won't be able to proceed if that report flows through to a final. So the government found a pretext to accuse the Tasmanian Planning Commission of bias. How was it biased? Because it read my report and it based some of the things that it said on my report. And so they've shunted those aside and said, we'll just take this through the Parliament. And that was part of the process, although it was more to do with the budget that produced the motion of no confidence and then a new election and the recreation of pretty much the same situation that we had before the election.
This use of usually Big Four consultants, or you throw in McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group and any other high-profile group, to provide 9 layers of air quotes independent reports. I couldn't date it exactly, but it seems to have proliferated in the 2000s, 15, 20 years ago. Rapidly became ubiquitous as a tool for governments to pretend that there was some sort of good faith, independent assessment of competing policy ideas when the decision had been made or had already been made or was made without any reference really to policy imperatives. It was driven by politics. It was driven by where the need to pick up
Or
a
you
seat
have
or
them,
whatever.
or you have them stringing along as part of the team, and you can deploy them in various kinds of ways. But you're pretty confident that they will produce a report. I mean, if you do this skillfully, you produce a report which is not professionally completely kind of flagrantly outrageous, but which is consistent with what the people who pay you want you to find.
At what point did we go down this route of, and I'm treating all government as a monolith here, when of course government is a highly diverse entity in Australia, but at what point did we go down the route of saying that we were happy with this fig leaf of independent modelling, rather than, first of all, an within government assessment carried out by a public service with credibility and expertise. But secondly, as the reflection of a need to try and convince the public, or probably more particularly the media, that there was still an element of deliberation going on here, versus simply finding some consultants who could explain that your idea was very good. What changed in our system that we ended up having so many consultants providing so many reports based on so much interesting mathematics in support of decisions that were not really about the policy substance, but about political considerations?
Well, I think, my first rule is not to imagine there was a golden age when things were hugely better. So I worked, when I first worked in a ministerial office was 1983, and we had to deal with an organisation then called the Department of Industry and Commerce. And it took me, I was in my 20s, it took me, I don't know, 6 months, 9 months, a year to work out that these guys didn't have any strategic idea of what they were doing. They held lots of meetings with lots of industry folks, and they tried to keep them happy. So there's a lot of that in government. It was something that was handed to us by I'm sure that's there's a lot of this true in other countries as well. But the idea of time servers and careerists and so on in government is not that those are not. I don't think that'll shock you that that's an old story. Then one of the things that happened was that economists had this extraordinary breakthrough. My father was an economist in this early wave. We now call it neoliberalism. It got called economic rationalism. And the thing is that economics provides you with very good answers to certain kinds of questions. We rather overdid what it provided. This then turned into overreach. But early on, economics tells you that governments are not going to be particularly good at setting shopping hours, at telling commercial airlines what meals they should serve and what routes they should go on and what times they should go on the routes. And they're not good at putting tariffs on imports and all these kinds of things. So along comes a discipline called economics, and suddenly I've likened this to putting goggles on. You look at this complete maze that has been constructed, for instance, the local content schemes in cars and textiles, clothing and footwear. You look at this maze, you put on the goggles and you go, none of this makes any sense. If you take it all away, things will be okay. It'll take a while, and we might want to help some people with some adjustment to the new reality, but things will be okay. This then turned into a craze, and we pursued this formula in all kinds of areas where it doesn't belong, where you need to do something much more sophisticated in banking, in infrastructure, in education, in health, and so on. And in the process of doing that, insofar as we had some strategic capability in departments, it kind of atrophied, you could argue. I'm not sure that that's right, but certainly one of the ways in which consultants have made themselves a very good living is, for instance, appealing to very large corporates. And it turns out to be useful for CEOs and boards to have a team analytical capability that it can then dress up and provide reports and also pass the buck. That's also a nice thing to be able to do. You say, well, that's what they say, and then of course we've even got this in our in our slogan where no one ever got fired for buying IBM. Well, IBMs are computers, but if you want advice, if you say it's McKinsey, well, McKinsey's got this great commercial reputation. It's got some other aspects to its reputation if you know a bit more. But anyway, so it's all those. Yes, just ask the Sackler family, but it's all those kinds of things. So it's a series of things. But I still think, Treasury, for instance, still retains a lot of strategic power today, probably more than it ever did. Probably tax office, maybe health. I don't know. I haven't worked that much in health. But when you have a large amount of stuff that you've got to look after, you tend to, or systems that need to run, you tend to need to retain those capabilities, but then but consultants are terribly, if you've got some money, and these departments have got reasonable amounts of money, they're terribly handy. You can get these very nicely packaged up reports that look like you really know what you're doing, and you don't.
There's a tendency, and I've perhaps been guilty of this myself, but I try to avoid it, which is to end up blaming every wrong in society on neoliberalism.
Yeah.
But one of the ironies, at least let's call it an irony rather than a problem, it seems to me over the last 30 years, is that if we perhaps slightly mischaracterise neoliberalism as about dramatically shrinking the role of government and letting markets make far more of the decisions that we think are important. In Australia, at least, and perhaps elsewhere as well, that's occurred at the same time as there has been more and more intervention and attempted intervention than ever by business and other stakeholders in the decision-making process of government, such that whilst government's been in furious retreat from intervention, the rest of society has been furiously trying to intervene ever more in government decision-making. Well, A, is that a correct assessment? B, if it is, what's behind that irony? I've got a suspicion that it's partly because even though we've reduced the role of government in a lot of areas, government is actually doing a lot more these days, particularly over the last 10 years in relation to things like the care economy than it ever did back in the 1980s. So
yeah, so I think that it's slightly wrong, and the way that it's wrong is that if deregulation won't work, you're not going to be deregulating, you're going to be re-regulating it. Mm-hmm. Now, everyone thinks that you're deregulating it. Everyone thinks that you're deregulating, for instance, electricity transmission. So electricity transmission used to be fully government. It used to be a government operation. The government built electricity transmission, and if it mucked things up, then the people got pretty annoyed with it and might vote in another party. Then we say that we're deregulating electricity transmission. We sell off the wires, and then we introduce an extremely complicated
Byzantine
price regulation mechanism. We get it wrong. The public debate simply, and maybe we'll get onto this later on, but the public debate simply isn't up to anything more than regulate or deregulate. It isn't, because when you're regulating something that needs intensive regulation, it isn't. If you're arguing about whether to regulate or not regulate, you're having the wrong argument. Mm-hmm. You need the argument about whether this is any good or not. And and you can't deal with that. You can't deal with it on the news. You can't deal with it on the 7:30 report, and you can't even deal with it on Late Night Live, a longer interview program. It's hard and uncertain work. So what effectively happens is that highly complex things just disappear into a professional world. And in that world, it's very handy to have a consultant, although bureaucrats know the game too, which is that everyone's putting on a show. Everyone is affecting everything's okay, the adults have arrived. That's the feel that everyone gives you. Everyone goes through the motions. I have been involved I'd probably in my life done about 15, quote, independent government inquiries. They were pretty independent. Some of them were with the Productivity Commission, and it led me to a little slogan, which is that every independent government inquiry is its own cover-up. Now, that doesn't mean that these are all scandals. One or two of them were scandals. What it means is that if you're doing a report, let's say in the Productivity Commission, you, at the end of this process, you think you've done quite a good job, but you think you kind of screwed this bit up and you fudged that bit. You don't say that publicly. I didn't say it publicly. No one says it publicly. Because if you did say it publicly, the press would sort of turn this into some expose. So the whole thing is couched in performativity, and that simply gives you a kind of shut-in syndrome. You can't. The incentives to do things well rather than badly are not there. They don't go all the way up to the people. They don't. You don't get into trouble for with anyone for just sort of making it look okay when you hadn't really worked out what you were doing. The Cutler Review into Innovation, by the way, is one of the ones where what happened was really quite scandalous. And we got away with it fine. We did the best we could in 2 or 3 weeks before the report had to be presented. And the media politely applauded.
Again, one of these, one of the bogeymen of the sort of debates about the quality of decision making is the role of the media. I'm of the view that if for those who have a not completely unjustified, nostalgic view of the Hawke and Keating years, one of the observations I always make is that the media was very different back then. It was a much more unitary media across a much smaller number of outlets and platforms, and therefore, in a sense, more easily controlled both by moguls and by politicians, particularly if you were excellent as a media manipulator, as Bob Hawke was. That started breaking down as digital emerged and was completely wrecked, I think, by social media, and we now have a very fragmented space. And good luck to anyone thinking they can control that. Which means that the task of actually engaging in good faith deliberation over policy it becomes much more difficult. You can't do what Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister, and he said the way to have a debate is you talk about the problem, you identify the problem, and then you invite people to talk about the solutions. So you let people know what the problem is. And it was a kind of a Hawke and Keating style model.
It was a Hawke and Keating, but watch the magician's hands closely. So I think, obviously what you're saying is true, but I think it's a little bit too easy to blame social media. So what happened in the Hawke-Keating years was that deliberation occurred. It occurred largely behind closed doors, and it occurred in an extra parliamentary forum that the Labor Party had created, that Bob Hawke was advised by people like my father would never work, and it did work. So this was the Accord. You had the unions. The business community were not formally part of the Accord, but they were absolutely part of the Accord, and they were the fundamental social partners, and they were put in a room and they were asked to answer the Spice Girls question. Tell me what you want, what you really, really want. Now, the Treasury, the Commonwealth Treasury is in this room, and the Commonwealth Treasury and the business community agree that on a proposition called the real wage overhang, that we were paying workers too much, business was insufficiently profitable and so couldn't be expected to invest. And so how are we going to solve that? Well, the way we solved that was with a series of wage tax trade-offs in which the unions, I won't say employees, the unions are representing employees, but there are also plenty of employees they're not particularly representing. And what they get is improvements in the social wage. They get Medicare. They get superannuation. They get tax cuts that are targeted to their situation, and that effectively creates an agenda. And that agenda is taken into Parliament, and the opposition is rendered largely irrelevant. And that's very different to Malcolm Turnbull saying, well, I'm going to talk about it and I want solutions to develop, because the role of the opposition is to just screw you over. The role of the opposition is to just go hunting for something that you can disagree with. At the moment, we have people make in high dudgeon about the idea that the slight increase in tax on superannuation, substantial increase on tax on superannuation for the top, is it 0.5% of people with super funds? It's something
Of
like
that
that.
order of magnitude, yeah.
It's a tiny number, and to make this work, capital gains are taxed on on valuation, not on realisation. We don't wait until you've sold the asset to charge you capital gains tax on people with over $3 million in their superannuation. Well, the government will probably be able to get all that stuff through, can get that stuff through. But that such a tiny thing is turned into a big mountain. A little molehill gets turned into a mountain, and that's you can't change lots of things in that situation. So I see the Accord as a kind of template for dealing with essentially dysfunctional Parliament. And I think you and I would both agree, it's become more dysfunctional with the passage of time. Let me say one more thing regarding this idea that the media were kind of better. And again, obviously I concede some of that. I remember when Gareth Evans was the Shadow Treasurer. Now that's 10 years on from the Hawke Government. I'm not sure exactly the year, but it's a long time from, it's a couple of decades ago. And Gareth Evans is in a press conference as the Shadow Treasurer, and they're putting together their election policy, and the press conference descends into the read my lips moment. And that is, can you guarantee, so Gareth Evans says something like, we will not raise taxes. We won't raise taxes on Australians. We won't increase income tax. So then he gets asked and grilled on, will there be any changes in the Income Tax Act, which runs to 6,000 pages or whatever it runs to? And Gareth says, we are not guaranteeing that we are going to completely pickle the Income Tax Act in aspic. We're not going to parcel it up for museums in the next 1,000 years. We will continue to do due maintenance on it, but we will make sure that that no one genuinely thinks that we're putting taxes up on ordinary Australians. Some answer like that. That is written up in large letters in the Australian the next day, Gareth Gaff. Now just think about that and think about what it means for all the incentives on politicians telling anyone anything. And the way in which politics becomes this process in which you try and trap people, and that means you've trapped some eyeballs the next day because you've got a headline, and you're making a thoroughly negative contribution to anyone's ability to think about anything.
And yes, two key elements of that for me: the Australian and the word gaff, which is, of course, the great word that every politician is taught to fear.
Yeah. But you look at Sarah Ferguson's interviews on 7:30 Report; they're largely the same kind of thing. They're probing around for forms of words.
Or David Spears, some of which are very, very good, in which he relentlessly drills down on a particular point until a George Brandis sort of cracks open.
That was good because George Brandis was exposed as someone who didn't know what he was talking about. That's entirely legitimate. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I'm really quite sympathetic to the politicians because they're putting on this show. This stuff comes at them constantly, a bit like being a journalist, and they're doing the best they can. And it's not perfect. I couldn't do it.
How do we reverse the polarity of the neutron flow, to use the immortal line from Doctor Who? How do we reverse the incentives and try to crowd back in, genuine deliberation, if not good faith, into the broader process?
Why don't we, just before we get onto that question, why don't we just generalise this to go from Tasmania to the federal sphere, if you like, because my argument is that very similar things are happening in the federal sphere. So if you look at the election in Tasmania, it was conducted according to the Faulty Towers episode, nobody mentioned the Germans. So what the Labor Party and the Liberal Party knew was that 60% of Tasmanians don't want the stadium. They're both terrified that maybe over 60% of people would agree to the stadium if it was necessary to have the team. And so it was really important for them not to deliberate on that question. the strategy is to avoid difficulty. You avoid, because if you avoid difficulty and you give these bland, abstract answers, my plan, all this stuff, we've got a positive plan for the future, not like my opponents, they'll make you pay. If you avoid, the best you can do is to not have those things discussed, because there's nothing in it for you. You end up in a difficult radio interview, which then gets written up, as gaff. Now, let's look at the recent federal election. What are the big issues facing Australia? One is that we're going to need to spend, I'll get to military things, but just if we think about ageing and disability, we know that we need to spend a great deal more on both of those things over time. We know that after a brief period of surpluses, the budget is running into substantial structural deficit. So the election should be about what the two parties have to offer about how to address those things. Well, that's not only a misunderstanding, it's the exact opposite. The election is about nobody mentioned the Germans. It's about not talking about that. Or rather, what you can do, if you're the opposition or even the government, you can say, there's red ink as far as the eye can see, but you can't say anything specific. The sort of thing I'm talking about is, hey, by the way, tax cuts in 5 years' time, we'd like to give them to you, but we don't think we can afford them and we won't be paying them because we all agree that we need to not live beyond our means. Add to this the even more diabolically difficult questions about Australian sovereignty in a much more dangerous multipolar world, and we're going to have to spend more money. We're committed to spending more money on defence. And then we have AUKUS. And AUKUS is, our plan is that maybe at some point we'll get the fantasy submarines, and in the meantime we'll pay someone $400 billion to build these things. Now, I'm not a military expert, and it may be that is the best plan A, but not having a plan B didn't work out very well for us with Singapore in World War II, and it is simply outrageous. Although I'm using moral language, and I'm not really saying that these people, they're not doing their job, the job that a governance system should do, but they're doing their job as political partisans, because if they step outside of the guardrails, there be dragons and there be gaffs. And that's the world that we're in. And we sort of, all we can say about this is, well, that's democracy and it's better, it's better than any other system that's been tried. And my argument is that we can do democracy in a different way that doesn't have these kinds of dreadful costs. I mean, is it possible to think of it is possible to think of a worse system, but I mean, as far as focusing on the difficult decisions and trying to make them, that's not what our electoral system
because
of democracy
we
is about.
we have I think most of us have a quite limited conception of what a democracy amounts to. Most of us are unaware unless we're forced to study the Greeks and the Romans, to use Woody Allen's phrase, at university, that in fact, no, there are different kinds of democracy and they can work in different ways. And we've only got one particular model, and that's been mediated through all sorts of layers of thinking over the last 2,000 plus years. And we're not stuck with the one model that we've got. And we don't even need necessarily to change the constitution to introduce other forms of democracy into how we operate.
So I'm not. Here's the thing: the way I like to present my thinking on this is not I've got a new plan for you. I boil it down to a very simple proposition that all democracies are like a three-legged stool. Part of the democracy, part of the democratic institutions is direct democracy. In our system, that's the vote. Everyone gets to directly influence the government. In ancient Athens, it was the assembly. Now, of course, I guess one has to do the normal disclaimer that I'm actually in favour of votes for women, and I don't believe in slavery, and those two things were characteristic of Athenian democracy. So obviously I'm not suggesting any of those things. So in Athens, they have direct democracy. We have direct democracy, but it's very thin direct democracy. And then there are two other stools. One is representation by election, which we've completely doubled down on.
Yep.
But there is another way to, and when you hear the term representative democracy, everyone thinks of elections and your representative in Congress or Parliament. But we also have another representative democracy in every court that has a jury. And they're our representatives in a very different way. The members of a jury, I call it representation by sampling, but it's a lottery system in which you get, and what's being suggested in politics is that you get, and has been practiced in politics, is that you have a lottery and you make sure that you keep drawing people from the lottery, keep drawing balls out until you have a group of say 50 or 100 people who are broadly demographically representative of the community. And then you involve them in deliberation. And Athens had most of its executive bodies and its judicial bodies were chosen by sortition, or this lottery system. We use it. We use it in our judicial branch. It's in the American Constitution. It's in Magna Carta, and so on. The Athenians also used elections, but not very much. They used elections where they felt that merit was important, so they used elections for generals of the army, but there were 10 at any time, and they had a kind of collective capability. You know, they were in themselves a deliberative force, and they also had some elections for some financial officers. So we all have this three-legged stool, and what I'm arguing is that we are in a kind of Magna Carta moment where we need to take representation by sampling not out of, we need to leave it in the judicial branch, but we need to introduce it into the other branches, the branches of government that we associate with politics.
Now, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, is that not a touching but naive commitment of faith in the essential wisdom of the common people, one that's not necessarily borne out by our everyday experience? Are people up to that? Are they going to be better than the politicians that make their way into the our other form of democracy? Why is sortition going to deliver a better group of of people making a deliberation than?
Okay, so there's a number of approaches to this. One is to say I'm interested in this body as a check and a balance. I'm not saying I'm not sort of Karl Marx or Friedrich Hayek saying here's the textbook, change what you're doing and do it all this way. So really all I'm arguing for is to develop this, but I can respond to your points. The experience of citizen juries is really amazingly positive. Almost everyone who sees them working is impressed. The citizen jurors themselves are usually polled after the event, and they describe, usually something like 95% say it was good, 60-odd% say it was very good, and if you can't take halves 2 or 3 times down to about the 5% of the people there regarded as life-changingly good, they go and stand for council at the next opportunity. They start some organisation in their public, in their communities. Now, the other thing you have to do is we have to stay in the actual world rather than the world of our heads. And the actual world is that the people we have there, we have some very capable people, we have some less capable people, but they're all increasingly preoccupied with the wrong question, which is how do I maintain or gain some political advantage with this issue? How do I wedge my opponent or whatever? And those types of motives are almost entirely absent. So these are very different things. And now maybe you can argue that I'm overselling this. If you see some of these things, if you see some of these things in action, I think you would be pretty amazed. But what has just jumped out at me as I've thought about this, just pondered it over years, is that this is a profoundly different way for human beings to govern themselves, to make decisions. And the more I look at it, the more when I see something that's unattractive about the politics in front of me. Take Pauline Hanson. Pauline Hanson's not my kind of person. There are things about her I pretty strongly dislike. There are things about her that I respect. She's courageous, and we'll just leave it there. That's not a bad start. I see a lot of what's wrong with Pauline Hanson is that Pauline Hanson is in a completely toxic environment. She lives or dies as a politician by drawing attention to herself. So she'll dress up in burqas, what a great visual gag, and so on and so forth. In the United States, the office of the presidency was such in 2012, I think this happened, that when Barack Obama gives a State of the Union address, he is listened to by the entire Congress in silence. That's a statement that Americans make about their history as a constitutional republic, of which they are deeply proud and rightly proud. And some guy yells out, some Republican guy, when Obama's talking about Obamacare, some guy yells out, "You lie, and you will remember the event." Now, he got $2 million worth of donations that weekend. Okay? So this competitive dynamic is just is simply tearing away at the centre of politics. I don't mean the ideological centre. I mean the social centre, the sense that we are all, that we owe the I don't like the idea of a head of government that we're all sort of pretending is like like a monarch or a deeply respected person. They're a politician. But anyway, that's their tradition, just being torn to pieces by the fact that this is kind of disappearing into a vortex of competition, which is destroying the very thing that we're supposed to end elections, saying, "Well done, you won this election."
And we respect the process.
I'm so happy I live in a democracy. I'm a bit pissed off that the Democrats are in power or the Republicans are in power. No. It's coming for the lot. And that's what isn't happening. So let me just give you a list of the ways in which what happens in a jury is different. So in representation by election, you get the separation of the governed and the governing. You get performativity by necessity. You get this word that is a Teflon word in our society, accountability. The people at the bottom are supposed to be holding the people at the top to account. Well, how's that going then? So we disappear into sort of accountability theatre, which we've spoken about with consultants and politicians don't mention the war, all that kind of stuff. And none of these things are true of this other way to represent the people. So it's self-regulating, it's unitary. Of course, people can compete in there and they can argue in there. You hope they do sometimes. But they're physically reminded that they're all living together and they're seeking to deliberate, to compromise where they can, to agree to disagree where they can't. All of the framing of this is different. And as Aristotle described elections as aristocratic or oligarchic, precisely because, well, for two reasons. They separate those who govern from those they govern. And it's also a way of allocating power where these people who are ruling over you are the best in some sense. If you have a well-functioning aristocracy, they are the best. That's what people like Aristotle and Plato were kind of interested in. And of course, we all know that it's mostly about wealth and power. And and Aristotle described democracy, has a beautiful description of democracy, which is that it is a community where people take turns in governing and being governed. Now, again, I'm not trying to argue, hey, let's get rid of everything we've got and go in this direction. What I'm saying is, can we please introduce this retrovirus into this highly toxic environment that we have? Because it does immense good to remind Democrats and Republicans, Labor and Liberal voters that they're friends. Really, I can show you videos of people who are in tears when they discover that they still disagree across the aisle, but that they do understand that they're stuck with each other and that they kind of respect these other people. And that's not what the system we have now is doing, the exact opposite of that.
This model has been tried in various forms elsewhere. We wouldn't be coming to it new at all. I think you repeatedly talk about the Michigan experience, which was, for anyone interested in US politics, I think was particularly fascinating. That the big, highly problematic issue of elections and electoral dynamics was addressed in Michigan. It's been used in Ireland. How widespread is
So
that?
I like to distinguish between single-purpose temporary citizen assemblies,
And a
which I
standing
see
body.
as
Yep.
than a standing body, which I see as less useful because it rehearses the idea that this is just a way for the governed to make requests of the government. But it certainly worked spectacularly in Ireland on two issues that the politicians were still in don't mention the war, business as usual regarding abortion and same-sex marriage. That cleaned those things up, demonstrating that there was strong popular support for change, and the change proceeded. And then there is a standing citizen jury, and that's operating right now in Belgium. It's operating in Paris, in one or two other places. And then the Michigan Independent, so giving this other way to represent the people a structural role, even if it's advisory, even if it is a convening power, which is what happens in East Belgium, where the citizen council can appoint other citizen councils to look at particular things and receive reports and so on. And then there's the thing that I take real succor from the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission is that I divide the government. For an economist, government is about providing public goods, and I think there are two public goods, what I call competitive public goods and unitary public goods. Competitive public goods are schools, hospitals, where politicians can compete, and one politician says, I'll give you more hospitals and fewer schools or higher taxes. You like to think that those numbers add up, and often they don't. And then I think of unitary public goods. The Auditor General is a unitary public good. We don't want political competition manipulating what the Auditor General finds. The Bureau of Statistics, the Bureau of Meteorology, the Parliamentary Budget Office. These things are supposed to be unitary public goods, and electoral funding, electoral salaries of politicians, and the drawing of electoral boundaries. These are unitary public goods, and the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission shows this new way to build an independent agency, far harder to corrupt than these other agencies.
Appointed experts, for example.
Exactly. You just appoint your person to it. So one of the big features of selection by lottery is that it is so hard to corrupt. And the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, I think, has gold-plated best practice, unitary public good provision, and I'm so pleased that little retrovirus exists in the world, because it's starting to. There are other states of the US that have something similar, and this is the sort of thing this is the way I would like to see this other way to represent the people grow.
Excellent. I'm going to bring this to a close. So, any concluding, succinct, pithy bon mots to send us on our way?
Well, let me you asked me to summarise the situation in Tasmania quickly, and I didn't follow your instructions. I summarised it at some length. Apologies for that, but I might do the same here. I'm not going to go on at great length, but we were going to talk about. I mean, what's really important to me is not just painting this picture. Who the hell is going to listen to me? It's trying to paint also a picture of how you might get there. And right now in Tasmania, you have a situation where government is up for grabs, and the Liberals are in a good position to basically continue with business as usual, and good luck to them. And I think, given the alternative, which is that it's the Labor Party and the Greens have not been able to put together any kind of way of collaborating in the way that the National Party and the Liberal Party have in Australia. And the idea I have is that you could have a standing citizen assembly. It could deliberate. Two critical things it can deliberate on is it can get you an answer on the question I put initially, which is if it puts a Tasmanian team seriously at risk, do you want to take it easy on the stadium and say, oh, we don't want to be bullied by the AFL? If our being humiliated by this standover process is the price of a team, we've got more of a sense of our own value than that. And the second thing is addressing Tasmania's very serious fiscal position, where it continues to spend more than it has. And again, if you're a parliamentarian, I've had a discussion with an independent parliamentarian in Tasmania for whom I have a very high regard. And that parliamentarian was saying to me, what position could I take to help with the budget? And we worked out collaboratively that there wasn't much she could do, because really what she should be arguing for is an increase in land tax, maybe at the reducing stamp duty, but you need to raise more tax. You need to stop doing certain things, and that's just unpopular. That just loses you votes, even if you're an independent.
Yep.
So we have to solve this problem, which is turning up everywhere in politics, where it's the don't mention the war problem. Don't mention anything that's difficult, because that's not what doing politics is about anymore. You get back into government, then you've got to try and do something difficult, but everyone hates you because you didn't tell them any of this stuff. And of course, if you had told them that stuff, you wouldn't be there.
That's the great contradiction, isn't it? Voters say they want honesty, they want authenticity, they want people to tell it to them straight, and then you show up and tell it to them straight, and that's probably the end of your...
And they get cut to pieces by them and the media. These two competitive systems, competitive elections and competitive media, mean that you cannot survive with that strategy. And so you have to be a really high-level magician, as Bob Hawke was, as Bill Clinton was, this idea, anyway, I could go on, but my point is that there are so many areas now which are subject to don't mention the war at the federal level, fiscal policy, AUKUS, infrastructure, emissions trading, or rather net zero, all this stuff. And so citizen juries are a way that we can start to try to kind of try to create a centre around which we might be able to focus on the hard problems, not on the the interior decoration as we go into each election.
Well, look, fingers crossed, it can act like a virus, and we can get one example up, and even politicians can see the benefits. I would have thought a sensible politician seeing a mechanism like this as enabling them to talk about the war, even when they know they shouldn't be talking about the war, would be potentially very valuable. Nicholas, thank you very much for your time. It's been fascinating. There is lots more to talk about in this space, so I hope that we will have further discussions. Good. But I think we've ended up at a good place in relation to what I think is, and I might have written this, the most plausible, significant reform that we could actually undertake to address, to achieve better policy. I've advanced a lot in my time. A lot of them, I think, now are kind of a little bit more like window dressing than substantive. They're probably good stuff, like more transparency on donations, etc., etc. But this, I think, is I think something that would make could deliver a lot of bang for our buck, and is actually quite plausible in a way that a lot of utopian suggestions aren't.
And I like to refer to the scene in When Harry Met Sally, where the woman says, "I'll have what she's having." You have to show people this working. If you don't show them it working, firstly, they think everyone's stupid. This couldn't work, or they think, oh, it's another committee, or they think some politician is trying to use it to avoid a responsibility, as Julia Gillard did with carbon trading, but way back in the day. So we need to show it to people, and then I think a lot of people will be saying, I'll have what she's having. We could use that mechanism to solve this problem. Pokies is a good example.
Yeah, so all we really need is all the Citizens Assembly members to look like Meg Ryan, and we'll be fine.
That's right.
All right.
That's right.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks, Bernard.